I'd like to speak on the 2016-2017 report. Mr. Speaker, sir, the report actually talks about a number of recommendations, and we wholeheartedly agree with the findings and the recommendation of the committee. I'd like to thank the committee for the report, Mr. Speaker, sir. Mr. Speaker, sir, the committee talks about the black economy, which many of the members of Parliament have already addressed. There is a black economy. We are hoping that with the lower tax rates, as highlighted by the Honourable Minister for Industry and Trade, that there is greater compliance. Indeed, in many jurisdictions, what you will see is that when there is a lower tax rate, you will find greater compliance with the tax laws. So, for example, the corporate tax rates in Fiji only a few years ago, the Honourable Leader of Opposition talked about the general broad-based tax. In fact, it used to be about 33%. It used to be a lot higher. Today, corporate tax rate is 20%. Listed companies, corporate tax rate is 10%. And if you are regional and global head office, you pay a tax rate of 17%. So that increases compliance. But notwithstanding that, Mr. Speaker, sir, we still find that there are breaches. And we have repeatedly said in Parliament, and indeed prior to Parliament and outside Parliament, that there are a lot of taxpayers who actually don't comply. Of course, there are many taxpayers that do comply. We have also said, and Honourable Prasad is perhaps not necessarily being forthright with this, we have said for a number of years now, Mr. Speaker, sir, that FRCS needs to view taxpayers as clients, as customers, because you need to humanize individual taxpayers. If you simply start seeing them as taxpayers, you will not necessarily treat them with a level of perhaps respect or perhaps understanding of what their business or what their individual financial circumstances may be. And we have also, Mr. Speaker, sir, repeatedly said there needs to be specialization within FRCS. You will find that, for example, if we have a company that may have a gross turnover of, say, $10 million, being attended by one particular FRCS staff. When that person is finished, the next 5 minutes, you have another person that comes along, they may have a gross turnover of only $300,000. And the same staff of FRCS deals with those two different client bases. They're completely different. Businesses are different, their financials are different, cash flows are different, what they actually do in business is completely different. So what we have actually said to FRCS, there needs to be specialized people to deal with different categories of different sizes, and indeed different segments within FRCS. We have publicly sort of chastised the idea of FRCS staff being very heavy-handed. And I've said this in Parliament repeatedly, not only what Honourable Prasad is referring to. We've said this repeatedly, and indeed we have said that to FRCS too. But Mr. Speaker, so many of the members actually don't realize that actually FRCS by law is an independent body. And you know, Honourable Prasad comes and says, I've heard this, somebody told me this, about individual taxpayers. I love him to tell us which staff member told that, because he is actually complicit in actually breaching the confidentiality provisions within FRCS Act. Completely complicit in doing that, because he is now getting individual taxpayer information. Individual taxpayer information is actually quite, disturbing, Mr. Speaker, sir. Mr. Speaker, sir.
Order.
Mr. Speaker, sir.
Order.
If Mr. Honourable Prasad believes that there is untoward behaviour going in FRCS, if he has the evidence, as he says, I urge him, please go to FICAC today and report it. Please do it. Please do it. Don't come here and get into these shenanigans and making all sorts of allegations when in fact he is actually complicit in the breach of the privacy and confidentiality requirements, as you find in the Banking Act. He knows that. Mr. Speaker, sir, the other point is that again, the recommendation 2 talks about the percentage of tax revenue that's been collected vis-a-vis the GDP and vis-a-vis the various benchmarks that have been set. Yes, the revenue collection of FRCS is far greater as a percent of GDP than in Australia. And Honourable Prasad also then mentioned, well, if that's the case, then let's get the same salaries. I mean, as an economist, anybody knows that you don't do that. This is a percentage comparison. It is not about the nominal value itself. So you should understand that. If that's the case, then let's all pay Australian real estate price. Let's all pay then Australian, transportation costs. I mean, this is silly. It's so trite is not even worth responding to, Mr. Speaker, sir. Mr. Speaker, sir, the other point is, of course, is that, again, just because the revenue collection may not in certain years meet the targets does not mean that GDP is necessarily affected. Any economist with basic knowledge would know that, Mr. Speaker, sir. We don't need to school people about this. In any case, the GDP figures, Mr. Speaker, sir, again, he should know this, years as a consultant, years as an academic, that the GDP figures actually done by Fiji Bureau of Statistics. And of course, Mr. Speaker, sir, they work with organizations like IMF. It's not done in Ministry of Finance or Ministry of Economy. He's saying, Mr. Speaker, sir, that somehow or the other the GDP figures are concocted. That's what he's implying. So, Mr. Speaker, sir, again, these GDP figures have been validated by third parties. World Bank, IMF, ADB, Fiji Bureau of Statistics, Reserve Bank of Fiji, other organizations, Mr. Speaker, sir. And Mr. Speaker, sir, just, again, Honorable Nawikula mentioned about, we are in crisis, there's no money and all of this. I have the figures, Mr. Speaker, sir, which are reserved from the Reserve Bank of Fiji. And Honorable Tambuya had mentioned about this some time back. The liquidity in Fiji as of last week, Friday, stands at $551 million. Mr. Speaker, sir, and the foreign, the foreign reserves, Mr. Speaker, sir, the foreign reserves, Mr. Speaker, sir, as of last week, Friday, stands at $2.1 billion. And Mr. Speaker, sir, Mr. Speaker, sir, the inflation rate as of last Friday was 0.7%. Mr. Speaker, sir. Mr. Speaker, sir, I also wanted to go back to the issue of Recommendation 3 about the various legislation that needs to be reviewed. And we completely agree with that, Mr. Speaker, sir. As we have highlighted previously, that there is a number of laws that are going to be reviewed, and we are currently working with the New Zealand Tax Office, Mr. Speaker, sir, in looking at our tax laws, the customs laws in particular. And there is quite a lot of work that needs to be done in that, Mr. Speaker. So, in fact, as we've said before, and we have not actually shied away from talking about these matters, is that in the customs area is where we find a lot of the, there's a lot of laxity in that space. One of the common things that has actually happened is that in the customs area we find people, for example, who smuggle cigarettes. We see there's a question there. Some businesses actually smuggle cigarettes in the containers. We also find, Mr. Speaker, sir, that there is an under-declaration of the value of the goods that's being imported, and therefore the VAT that they pay is far less than what they actually should be paying, and where they're paying far less duty than they should be paying. But there is, of course, a need to harmonize these laws, and we have got a particular process in place, and we'd like to, of course, thank the committee for that recommendation of this, Mr. Speaker, sir. Mr. Speaker, also in respect of the recommendation 4 about the outreach programs, and of course the self-assessment, FRCS, we have, as the members would know, that in the last year's budget, in the 2018-19, and to a lesser extent this year, but more so in the 2018-2019, 2017-2018 budgets, we actually had allocated a fairly large amount of grant in respect of FRCS updating their software to make it a lot more user-friendly and to be able to ensure that we have a lot more e-filing of various tax requirements and of course meeting the obligations. Mr. Speaker, sir, I also would like to comment on the, somebody made the comment, I cannot remember now who, in respect of this committee that has been put in place, and again some very trivial comments being made about it being all Fiji First people and people who supported us, only large businesses. I'd like to highlight, Mr. Speaker, sir, we actually wrote to all the individual large organizations, so Fiji Institute of Accountants, Fiji Lawyers Association, manufacturers, we wrote to Women in Business, we wrote to Fiji Chamber of Commerce, Fiji Employees Federation, the Architects Association, the Hotel Association, all of them, we wrote to all of them. Some responded, some of them did not. And Mr. Speaker, sir, of course, we then, given the fact that some of them did not, we actually then also approached individuals. So, for example, organizations like the Fiji Institute of Accountants responded, the Fiji Chamber of Commerce responded, the Women in Business responded, the Fiji Commerce Association, Fiji Chamber of Commerce, they also responded, Mr. Speaker, sir. But then, of course, I'd like to highlight, there's a lot of allegations made about small businesses not being included. And let me highlight, Mr. Speaker, sir, it's not just about small business. It's also about getting younger people, because we find more young people are getting into business. As we know, we've said that young people should not only be job seekers, but they should also be job creators. And there's a number of initiatives through the Ministry of Industry and Trade, the YES program, etc., to try people to encourage them. Now, I'd like to highlight a couple of them. One of them is Adeline Tutu, who's started up her own business with the fitness program. She's launched her own app. She has a TV program, but she's actually struggled with it. As a mother, she set up her own business. She's actually on the FRCS committee. We have people like Winston Hill. Again, as we all know, he won a medal for us. He started up his own business again. He's featured in the under 30. These people have a network of young people, small businesses who started up. They're actually in the committee, so they'll look at these things from a different perspective. We also have a lady called Marita Manley, who actually represents all the small tourism operators. The backpacker places, the people who do these ancillary, what we call ancillary tourism operators, taking people on tracks, walking through villages, doing village tours. This is the association that she's representing, Mr. Speaker, sir. So a whole range of people actually have been put in this committee. We have also Sangeeta Maharaj, those of you who've been to the Eden restaurant. This is a group, another clientele of people, the restaurateurs. These are the people who are being represented on this. Mr. Speaker, sir, we've got the Carrier Association. They are also in the committee, Mr. Speaker, sir. We've got the Hot Bread Kitchen. We've got John Samsoni. I'm really, enthused by his enthusiasm to actually be in this committee. So it's a whole cross-section of people, Mr. Speaker, sir. Of course, there are some large businesses like the Motibai Group, the Tapus Group. You've got the hardware people in there, but they also represent segment. Gordon Jenkins, who's the current president of the Fiji Construction Council. The reason why these people have been put in, Mr. Speaker, sir, is because they actually know, or their businesses or their associations have a flow and effect to many other businesses. Construction, so you have the electrical works, you have the people who are subcontractors, the guy who does the digging of the foundations. Everybody in the chain will be affected. So everybody's views will come through these people. And that's how it's been selected, Mr. Speaker. So I'd like to thank all these members, wholeheartedly for being in this committee. So, Mr. Speaker, sir, the reality of the matter is that FRCS, of course, has a lot of work to do too. FRCS also has a lot of work to do, we believe, as a government, in respect of lifting up the customer service, in being sensitive to various business conditions in which they operate in. And also, Mr. Speaker, sir, just to highlight, there have been years where FRCS has actually exceeded their target. Nobody talked about that. When the budgeted target has been set, in fact, they have exceeded that. Of course, sometimes they have been below that. A lot of it depends on the market conditions. We talk about, if you, for example, have a cyclone, none of them talked about the fact that we had Cyclone Winston that wiped off the 1/3 of the value of our GDP within 36 hours, Mr. Speaker, sir. Within 36 hours, 1/3 of the value of our GDP is wiped out. Obviously, if Nandi Town, Bar Town gets flooded, the smaller businesses have difficulty, obviously the revenue collected will be less. It has a flow-on effect. But none of them spoke about that. If we really want to be candid, if we really want to be honest, if we really want to have a bipartisan approach to our economic well-being, then we need to be factually correct. We need to be factually correct, Mr. Speaker, sir. So, Mr. Speaker, sir, I think again, there's a false notion of compliance. They say that compliance is only if you, issue DPOs and fines and all. No, Mr. Speaker, sir. Compliance is also greatly enhanced if you have a lot more outreach programs. Compliance is also greatly enhanced if you have simplicity in your taxation system. That is what we are trying to do. Simplicity and removing subjectivity from the application of the rules and the policies. And this is one of the issues that we continuously highlighted to FRCS. The subjectivity needs to be removed. The actual information given out by individual staff we have found in our experience, there's one particular incident now where we've actually asked FRCS to pay the duty themselves because they made the misrepresentation to a particular group. It's an organization that went to FRCS and the staff there intimated to them that yes, you can get a duty waiver from the minister. Knowing full well that the minister does not give waiver on those things. Of course, when it came to us, we rejected it. But then when representations were made to us, certain evidence was shown to us that FRCS made the representation. We said that the organization that brought that particular product in, and it's actually a non-charitable, sorry, it is a charitable organization, religious-based organization, we said that you need to actually, FRCS needs to pay the duty on their behalf because why did you make false representations to them? So that's the level of service delivery we're trying to inculcate within the FRCS. So, Mr. Speaker, sir, of course there needs to be a lot more, we think, FRCS and the board. I cannot understand the logic that if a person chooses to be in a board, and there are many people who've sat in various boards, don't want to be paid because they believe they want to contribute to their country. What is wrong with that? What is wrong with that? Mr. Speaker, sir, perhaps they cannot fathom the idea that should they ever contribute to something without being paid. That's the issue. They cannot fathom that idea. Mr. Speaker, sir, Mr. Speaker, sir, I think there's quite a lot has been said. I'd like to thank the committee for their input into this, Mr. Speaker, sir. I think we all agree there's a lot of room for improvement in respect of FRCS itself. But of course, they've also done some good work, and we like to acknowledge the work that they have carried out. We believe there's a lot of capacity that needs to be built in within FRCS. Businesses nowadays are getting a lot more sophisticated. The transaction modalities are getting a lot more sophisticated. The technologies that are being used are getting a lot more sophisticated, and they change quite rapidly. In fact, sometimes on a monthly basis. So FRCS needs to keep up to speed with that. And of course, Mr. Speaker, sir, we wholeheartedly support the motion by the Honourable Member who moved this motion. Thank you.
I thank the Honourable Attorney-General for his contribution to the debate.